I never thought a simple company party could change the way I looked at someone, or even shift the rhythm of my heart when I thought about my own marriage. That night, it didn't rain. Streetlights cast a golden glow across the damp cobblestones, and inside the reception hall, there were soft smiles, clinking glasses, flickering candles, and mellow jazz humming in the background. It was the kind of scene made for relaxation. But my heart, it wasn't in tune with any of it. It was vibrating to something strange and off-key. Steve, my husband, was the reason I was there. He talked about this event all week, bubbling with the kind of excitement you'd expect from a kid counting down to summer break. "It's just a casual gathering. You'll enjoy it," he'd said, wrapping his arm around me, his eyes twinkling behind those familiar glasses. And I hadn't said no, even though, deep down, I've never felt comfortable at these kinds of social events, where people laugh a little louder than usual, talk a little more than necessary, and touch each other just a little longer than is polite. I wore a simple black dress, light makeup, and stood beside Steve as he made his rounds, shaking hands, exchanging small talk I barely followed. I was used to being his quiet shadow, not because I didn't matter, but because I understood my role. Wife, background. That is, until Carla walked in. I didn't recognize her at first. Just a figure passing under the chandelier light. Dark, flowing hair falling over her shoulders. A slender frame wrapped in a deep red dress, rich like wine. But then, I saw Steve's face light up. And Carla, with a sharp smile and a laugh that sounded like ice tumbling into a glass of whiskey, approached, brushing her hand lightly against his arm like they were long-lost friends. "Carla," Steve said, "you remember I told you about her, right?" I smiled politely and nodded. But truthfully, I didn't remember a thing. Carla didn't look away from Steve as they talked. She laughed a little too long at his jokes, leaned in a little too close every time he gestured. Every touch, no matter how brief or subtle, sent a chill crawling up my spine. No one was doing anything technically wrong, but everything felt wrong. I stepped out onto the balcony, searching for air that wasn't soaked in perfume and expensive wine. But less than 5 minutes later, Carla followed. She held a glass of white wine, that same smile, perfect, confident, and somehow just too polished to be real. "Mary, right?" she asked warmly, like we were old friends. "Hope you're enjoying the night." I gave a polite nod. "It's a lovely venue." Carla glanced back towards Steve, then back at me, eyes steady, unblinking. "Steve's a fascinating man," she said. "I can see why you've managed to keep him this long." I offered a light smile, but inside, the tide was beginning to turn. "But sometimes..." She took a sip of wine, then lowered her voice. "Everyone needs a little adventure, don't they?" I froze. Her words fell into the space between us like a knife, slicing through the artificial peace. What did she just say? Was she testing me? Suggesting something? Warning me? Or declaring war? Before I could respond,
her phone rang.
She smiled apologetically and disappeared back into the party, leaving me standing on the balcony, wine glass untouched, heart full of something far more bitter than anything in my drink. And from that moment on, I knew some women don't need to break what isn't theirs. They just slip into the cracks that are already there. And if you stay silent long enough, they just might walk right through. I used to think heartbreak always began with something dramatic, a revelation, a betrayal, a shocking confession. But sometimes it starts with something far smaller, a lingering glance, a smile that lasts just a beat too long, a sentence too vague to accuse, but sharp enough to rattle your soul. After that party, I couldn't sleep, not because Steve had done something wrong, but because I no longer knew what was happening. And worse, I had no idea who I could even talk to about it. Steve was the same. Up early, coffee in one hand, laptop in the other. He kissed my cheek before leaving for work, like he always did. And somehow, that just like always sent a chill down my spine. Because for women, some things don't require proof, only intuition. I started watching Steve more closely. He still smiled at me, still spoke with the same tone, But sometimes I felt like I was looking at someone I used to know deeply, who now felt like a stranger. And then one afternoon, while I was cleaning the kitchen, his phone lit up on the counter. A text from an unknown number, but I didn't need a name to know who it was. "Hi, Steve. I really enjoyed our chat the other night. We should get together sometime. Just the two of us." Winky face. I froze. Nothing explicit, nothing incriminating, but enough to drown a woman who'd been clinging to reason.
I didn't yell, didn't call him.
I did the only thing I could think of in that moment. I replied from his phone. "Thanks, Carla. Steve's busy right now, but I'll be sure to pass along your message." I set the phone back on the counter, just as Steve walked into the kitchen. He smiled. I smiled. A perfectly rehearsed scene. The only problem was, I wasn't sure I wanted to keep playing the part anymore. That evening, it rained lightly. Steve had another late meeting. I quietly boiled water for tea. And then, a knock at the door. Not Carla, but Sarah, an old neighbor. The same woman I once made ginger chicken soup for years ago, after her husband died. In her hands, a bowl of hot soup. "Steve mentioned you weren't feeling well," she said with a soft smile. I wasn't sure what you needed, but soup felt easier than asking. I took it. Her hands were warm. And something about that bowl of soup broke me, not because of the food, but because someone had seen me, amidst all the eyes drifting elsewhere. That night, I sat alone with that soup, in front of the TV. Each spoonful felt like it was unraveling something tight and tangled in my chest. I began to feel calm again, not because of Steve, not because of Carla, but because I remembered who I was. I was the woman who once loved with both hands open. I was the one who held this household together, who kept her husband, who stayed up all night caring for her sick mother without uttering a word. And then I thought, if a woman is strong enough to carry all that in her heart, then she is strong enough to protect that heart, too. I don't know what Carla sent after that. I don't know how Steve would react if I confronted him, but I do know this. From now on, I won't just observe. I'll step in, with my own voice, and I silently thank Sarah, not just for the soup, but for the way she looked at me, a look that made me want to live again. Some things in a marriage don't break with a loud crash. They dissolve slowly, through a text left unanswered, a glance no longer shared, or simply forgetting to ask, "How was your day?" But it's also those very small things, if used right, that can begin to heal the quiet cracks. All it takes is a bit of awareness, a pause, a moment of honest listening. The next morning, Steve woke up earlier than usual. I was still washing my face when I noticed a cup of coffee waiting on the table. He used to do that back when we first got married, but it had been a long time. I stepped into the kitchen. The scent of coffee filled the air, a silent apology, wrapped in steam. "Did you sleep well?" he asked. I looked at him, ready to say the usual fine. But instead, I just gave a faint smile. We both knew there were things waiting to be said. Lately, Steve had been coming home earlier. He no longer brought his laptop to bed. And I noticed he silenced his phone the moment he walked in. Something he'd never done before. Small changes, but they stirred something in me. One evening, as I was watering the plants on the porch, he came out holding 2 cups of chamomile tea. He handed me one. His hand brushed mine for just a second, but his eyes lingered much longer. "This tea's really good tonight," I said, still looking out at the bougainvillea. "I used warm water, not boiling, not cold," he said. "I read somewhere that if you want to preserve the flavor, you have to be patient." Then he paused, turned to me. "Maybe that's true of you, too." I froze. Not because the words were poetic, but because I had waited so long for him to see me not as a background presence, but as the person. In the days that followed, Steve began to share more. About work stress, about colleagues,
And about Carla.
"She's smart," he said, "but sometimes a little too friendly." I think I blurred the line without realizing it. I didn't respond. I didn't forgive him immediately. But I acknowledged it, because for the first time, He chose honesty, even if it made him vulnerable. That night, I lay in bed remembering the little things. The way he touched my shoulder when I coughed. The time he pulled out a chair for me and gently rubbed my back. The old love song he played one night. The one I used to adore when we were dating. Those were once the things that made me fall for him. And now, as he did them again, not perfectly, sometimes clumsily, they reached me in a way I didn't expect. I don't know if Steve is completely innocent. I don't know if Carla has truly backed off. But I do know the man in front of me is trying. Not with grand apologies, but by placing his hand on my shoulder each morning, asking, "What would you like for breakfast today?" Or by sitting silently next to me for an hour, just so I know he's here. And the strange thing is, trust doesn't return with proof. It returns in small gestures, like stones being carefully laid, back into a bridge that once collapsed. I don't know where we're headed, but for the first time in weeks, I placed my hand on the table, and Steve placed his on top of it. No words, and yet I knew I was no longer alone. Some conversations don't begin with words. They begin with a pause, a glance that lingers just a little too long, or a simple tea table set on what feels like an ordinary afternoon. That day, the sun was soft. Light streamed into the kitchen, casting warm strokes across the old wooden table, like a gentle brush dipped in morning gold. I set down 2 cups of tea, one for me, one for Steve, as if inviting him into a space I had quietly prepared, a space for truth. Steve sat down without asking anything, but I could see it in his eyes, a silence that knew how to wait. Not defensive, not impatient, just a man waiting for his wife to finally say what she had carried in her chest for far too long. That night, I began, fingertips resting on the warm porcelain. When I saw Carla touch your hand, smile at you like that, something inside me collapsed. Steve looked up. His eyes froze. But I didn't look back at him. I looked at the dust particles floating in the sunlight, like all the unsaid things still hanging in the air between us. I didn't think you were unfaithful, I continued, but I felt abandoned. Like in this world where someone can simply smile at the right moment, touch in the right place. A woman who's been a wife and mother for 20 years can suddenly feel like she's just extra. Silence. Then Steve spoke, voice low and slow. I never realized you felt that way. I gave a faint smile, one sadder than any tear, because I never told you. He reached out his hand, not to touch, just to place it close, as if asking, "May I stay?" I didn't push it away, but I needed more than that. "Steve," I said softly, "do you know what it feels like when people tell me I'm graceful? That you're lucky to have me, while inside I feel hollow. I live through proper dinners, punctual hugs, but I miss the look that tells me I've been chosen, not just present." Steve's eyes shattered like a cracked mirror, not from guilt, but from the sudden awareness that he'd lost his way in the routine of it all, and forgotten that even the person closest to him needed to be seen with fresh eyes. We sat quietly in the late afternoon light. Neither of us touched our tea again. It went cold, but strangely, it was in that stillness that Steve said something I wasn't ready for. "I saw loneliness in Carla," he said. "Not because I had feelings for her, but because something in her reminded me of myself, back when I felt invisible, in a life that looked full from the outside. I think I felt close to her for that reason. I closed my eyes, not out of pain, but because I understood. Sometimes closeness doesn't come from love. It comes from shared absence. And if you don't catch it early, it can become a quiet kind of betrayal." That night, I poured out the cold tea, washed the cups, and brewed a new pot. Not to start over, but to remind myself, this marriage is still worth keeping, if we're brave enough to be honest inside it. And that night, when Steve took his phone from his pocket, he didn't hide it. He set it face down on the table. The screen was turned away, but for the first time in a long while, his heart was finally facing me. Some evenings feel spontaneous, but in truth, they've been long awaited by the heart, like a candle left unlit for months, but still kept on the table, as if someone hadn't quite given up. I don't remember who suggested it first. All I know is that on that day, as the sunset poured like honey through the kitchen window, Steve walked in carrying 2 grocery bags. He avoided my gaze, but his voice was softer than usual. I figured it's been a while since we had a proper dinner together. I nodded, not cheerfully, not coldly, just enough. Enough to spark a small light inside him. We cooked together. Steve washed the vegetables. I cut the meat. No need for chatter. But in the ordinary sounds, running water, the knife against the cutting board, the soft clinking of pots, there was a quiet rhythm I once loved. Dinner wasn't fancy. Simple pasta with a touch of red wine. But Steve pulled out the crystal glasses, the ones we only used for special occasions. "Remember our 10th anniversary?" he asked, wiping dust from one of them. I smiled faintly. Back when we thought love only needed candles and music. "And now it needs conversation," he added, half joking, half true. On the table, 2 glasses of wine catching the candlelight, 2 plates of steaming pasta, and an old candle I found in the drawer, melted and half-used. But when lit, its flame still flickered like it had never been forgotten. I looked at Steve in that glow, a light that didn't hide the wrinkles at his eyes, or the silver creeping into his hair, but instead revealed the one thing that mattered most. His eyes still saw me, really saw me, from the heart. "I used to be afraid you'd leave," Steve said as dinner wound down. I set down my fork and looked directly at him. "I never wanted to leave," I replied. "But I also didn't want to keep living as someone's invisible wife." It wasn't an accusation. It was a condition for whether this marriage could still go on. Steve fell quiet, then reached for the wine bottle, refilling both our glasses. "Then let's start again from here," he said, his voice rough. Not from the wine, but from wounds not yet healed. That night, we didn't touch. No kisses. No embraces. But when I got into bed, Steve didn't open his laptop. He didn't scroll through his phone. He just lay there, turned to me, and asked something so simple, so old. But this time, I knew it came from a place of true presence. "Are you cold?" I shook my head softly, then pulled the blanket a little higher, not because of the chill, but because something inside me was slowly melting. I knew our wounds wouldn't heal in a single dinner, but I also knew love doesn't need roses or diamond rings to return. Sometimes, it just needs a meal made by 2 hands and 2 hearts willing to admit, we've hurt each other, but we're still here. And maybe that's enough to begin again. There are old photographs we no longer hang on the wall, but still keep tucked away in some drawer. Not because we're ready to remember, but because we're not yet ready to forget. That day, I was cleaning out an old bookshelf, the place where I stored things I couldn't decide to toss or keep. A birthday card from 5 years ago, my father's broken wristwatch, and a small chestnut-colored box, our wedding photo box. I opened the lid, and something tightened in my chest. The first photo was from our engagement day. I was wearing a simple white dress, my hair pinned up, and Steve stood beside me, younger, smiling, his eyes looking at me in a way that, if they could speak, would have whispered, "I choose you. Out of everyone in the world, I still choose you." A sharp ache ran through me, not from nostalgia, but because I couldn't remember the last time he looked at me like that. I took the photo out and held it for a long time. Then I folded it, gently, carefully, as if afraid to hurt the memory itself. That evening, Steve came home early. He saw me sitting at the dining table, bathed in the soft amber of the overhead light. I placed the folded photo on the table without a word. He noticed it, slowed his steps. His hand froze on the back of the chair. "I found it in the bookshelf," I said. A beautiful moment, but not enough to hold 2 people together. If one of them forgets why they began. He sat down, quietly, I never wanted to forget, he said. I just assumed you'd always be there. And when people think something is forever, they start taking it for granted. I nodded. I understood. All too well. Then Steve did something I never expected. He went into the bedroom and came back a few minutes later with a thin envelope. Inside was a photo Carla had sent him, the same one I had seen on his phone, the one that had made me go silent for days. You should be the one to keep this, he said, because it reminded me where the line is between what should and should never happen. I took it, but didn't open it. I didn't need to, because what mattered wasn't the photo itself, but the fact that he gave me the choice of whether to keep it or throw it away. Steve, I said, I don't need you to be perfect. I just need you to be real. And if one day someone else stirs something in you, I won't forbid the feeling, but I hope you'll tell me first, not leave me to guess.
He didn't speak.
Then nodded. I don't need someone else to feel alive again. I just need to remember how to love you, like I did in the beginning. We sat there, in that quiet golden light, silent, but not cold. I unfolded the wedding photo again, but I didn't put it back in a frame. I left it lying face up on the table, neatly, like an old chapter carefully reread, before writing a new one. And in that moment, I realized the heart doesn't heal through promises. It opens through truth. And sometimes, to open a door inside yourself, you have to be willing to fold away a photo you once believed would define forever. Love after the storm isn't loud. It doesn't burn bright like it did in the beginning, nor does it sparkle like the kind you see in movies. Love after hurt often arrives in silence, soft, real, and small, but enough for you to exhale and think, we still have each other. One weekend, Steve suggested we get away. Just the two of us. No phones, no laptops, no friends, no one else. I think we need to get out of the city for a while, he said. Not to escape, but to finally hear what's going on inside.
I didn't answer right away.
But the next morning, I had our clothes folded and 2 travel mugs of coffee waiting by the car. Some things don't need verbal agreement. Just 2 people willing to share the same road. We drove to the mountains, a small forest not too far from town, to a cabin rented from an old couple who'd lived there for over 40 years. The air there felt different. Not rushed, not crowded, just the kind of air that brushes past your shoulders like an invisible hug. Steve and I walked the leaf-strewn trails, not holding hands, but our steps fell in rhythm, like a habit we'd never quite lost. That evening, the air turned cool. We lit a fire outside the cabin, wrapped ourselves in a light blanket, and listened to the hum of crickets and the wind threading through the trees. You know, Steve said, breaking the quiet, when I thought I might lose you, not because of someone else, but because of the silence between us. I realized losing you wasn't like losing a routine. It felt more like standing in a house that used to echo with laughter, and now only holds furniture. Full, but empty. I stayed quiet. It was the first time I felt a kind of sadness that didn't come from anything specific, but from knowing we hadn't protected the ordinary in an extraordinary way. Steve stood up and went inside. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box. Nothing fancy, nothing showy, just something that looked like it had been held onto for a very long time. I don't know if this still feels right, he said, handing it to me, but if love needs a new promise, then I want that promise to be made from something old. I opened it. Inside was our old wedding ring, the one I had quietly taken off months ago, and slipped into a drawer without a word. Now it was here in his hand, shining again, not because it was polished, but because it had been cared for. Marry, he said gently. No kneeling, no audience, just the flicker of firelight behind him. Will you choose me again? Not marry me again. Just choose me. Even though I've lost my rhythm, gone silent, made you feel lonely in the middle of our marriage. If today is a new beginning, I ask for a chance. Not to love more brightly, but to love more fully. I didn't cry, but my heart tightened. My eyes stung, like smoke from the fire had reached them. I nodded, not because he proposed, but because I realized, even among unhealed wounds, we still had enough left to open our hearts. That night, as the air turned colder, I leaned my head on his shoulder, and, for the first time in years, I didn't need anything else. Not words, not vows, not proof, just this warmth. The warmth of someone who once let go of my hand, but came back, at exactly the right time. And in the hush of mountain wind, I heard something no one said out loud, that sometimes a marriage you thought was near its end can be proposed all over again, right in the middle of ordinary life. Love after the storm isn't loud. It doesn't burn bright like it did in the beginning, nor does it sparkle like the kind you see in movies. Love after hurt often arrives in silence, soft, real, and small, but enough for you to exhale and think, we still have each other. One weekend, Steve suggested we get away. Just the two of us. No phones, no laptops, no friends, no one else. I think we need to get out of the city for a while, he said. Not to escape, but to finally hear what's going on inside.
I didn't answer right away.
But the next morning, I had our clothes folded, and 2 travel mugs of coffee waiting by the car. Some things don't need verbal agreement. Just 2 people willing to share the same road. We drove to the mountains, a small forest not too far from town, to a cabin rented from an old couple who'd lived there for over 40 years. The air there felt different. Not rushed, not crowded, just the kind of air that brushes past your shoulders like an invisible hug. Steve and I walked the leaf-strewn trails, not holding hands, but our steps fell in rhythm, like a habit we'd never quite lost. That evening, the air turned cool. We lit a fire outside the cabin, wrapped ourselves in a light blanket, and listened to the hum of crickets, and the wind threading through the trees. You know, Steve said, breaking the quiet, when I thought I might lose you, not because of someone else, but because of the silence between us. I realized losing you wasn't like losing a routine. It felt more like standing in a house that used to echo with laughter, and now only holds furniture. Full, but empty. I stayed quiet. It was the first time I felt a kind of sadness that didn't come from anything specific, but from knowing we hadn't protected the ordinary in an extraordinary way. Steve stood up and went inside. When he returned, he carried a small wooden box. Nothing fancy, nothing showy, just something that looked like it had been held onto for a very long time. I don't know if this still feels right, he said, handing it to me, but if love needs a new promise, then I want that promise to be made from something old. I opened it. Inside was our old wedding ring, the one I had quietly taken off months ago, and slipped into a drawer without a word. Now it was here in his hand, shining again, not because it was polished, but because it had been cared for. Marry, he said gently. No kneeling, no audience, just the flicker of firelight behind him. Will you choose me again? Not marry me again.
Just choose me.
Even though I've lost my rhythm, gone silent, made you feel lonely in the middle of our marriage. If today is a new beginning, I ask for a chance. Not to love more brightly, but to love more fully. I didn't cry, but my heart tightened. My eyes stung, like smoke from the fire had reached them. I nodded, not because he proposed, but because I realized, even among unhealed wounds, we still had enough left to open our hearts. That night, as the air turned colder, I leaned my head on his shoulder, and, for the first time in years, I didn't need anything else. Not words, not vows, not proof, just this warmth. The warmth of someone who once let go of my hand, but came back, at exactly the right time. And in the hush of mountain wind, I heard something no one said out loud, that sometimes a marriage you thought was near its end can be proposed all over again, right in the middle of ordinary life. There are days when loneliness doesn't show itself through a sigh, but through a silence so long, so haunting, that it echoes inside your very own home. I live in a small, quiet neighborhood, the kind where people wave while mowing their lawns, ask how you're doing when picking up the mail, and then keep walking. Not noisy, not intimate, just enough to be part of the scenery. I, Martha, have lived here for most of my life, but lately I no longer feel like I'm part of anything. With age comes aching knees, unexplained fatigue, and worst of all, the sense that I'm slowly fading away from this world. I sat in my familiar armchair, staring out at the garden I once cared for. Now the grass is patchy. The flowers no longer bloom like they used to. I don't have the strength. And worse still, I no longer look forward to anything. Family is busy. Friends have grown distant. I blame no one. But my heart has never felt more barren. And that's when the knock came. It startled me. No one had called ahead. No one ever dropped by unannounced. My heart skipped, not from fear, but because, strangely, such an ordinary sound reminded me that I still existed. I walked over, opened the door, and there he was, standing in the soft afternoon light, Ben. Ben, the neighbor who's lived next door for a few years now.
A quiet man, reserved.
Around my age, we'd exchanged nods, talked about the weather, but we had never truly looked each other in the eye. Today, he held a small bag and wore a gentle smile. "Hello, Miss Martha." The first time he'd ever said my name. "I made some chicken soup. Thought you might need something warm." I stood still, not sure if it was surprise or the stirring of something I hadn't felt in so long. Being noticed. "Thank you, Ben." I reached for the bag, my hands trembling just a little. "You look a bit tired. If you ever need someone to talk to, or just sit with, don't hesitate to knock. We're neighbors after all." He turned and walked away, slowly, without expecting anything. But those words, they clung to something parched and quiet inside me. I stepped back into the house, cradling the bag of soup as if holding a kind of warmth I couldn't name. And I cried, not out of sadness, but because, for the first time in a very long while, I felt like I was still someone worth knocking on the door for. If you've ever felt like you're slowly disappearing from everyone's eyes, if you've ever lived in a house full of lights but no visitors, then subscribe to this channel, because here, every story is a gentle knock on your door, reminding you that you're still here, that someone, truly, might still see you. And then, just one day later, when Ben returned with a small bag of fresh fruit, I realized it wasn't the food that warmed my heart. It was the look in someone's eyes, who truly wanted to ask, "Are you okay?" That evening, I opened the bag of soup Ben had left. The aroma of simmered chicken and vegetables filled the kitchen. Not extraordinary, but strangely comforting. I couldn't remember the last time I had a hot meal, and even less the last time someone had cooked one for me. I ladled the soup into a bowl and sat at the table. Not because I was hungry, but out of respect for the kindness that had just been offered. And as the first spoonful touched my lips, I suddenly felt a sting behind my nose. Not from the seasoning, but from a heart. That night, I didn't sleep, not because I was in pain or tired, but because my mind kept circling one thought. Ben noticed. Someone I never expected to care was the first to knock. When I was beginning to fade into invisibility within my own life, he didn't say much. Just, "If you need someone to talk to, just knock." Simple, but true. The next morning, I sat by the window. Sunlight slanted gently through the wilted flower box. Something inside me felt different, lighter, more open, and I realized maybe I hadn't entirely disappeared. Someone had seen me, truly seen me. That afternoon, the knock came again. Soft, but sure. I opened the door, and once again, it was Ben. This time, he held a basket of fruit, apples, pears, a few peaches. He gave a small smile, his eyes meeting mine with a strange familiarity. "Just a few fresh things," he said. "I noticed you don't go out much. Thought maybe you'd like them." I took the basket, my hands slightly trembling, not from weakness, but because my heart was slowly relearning how to feel. "Ben, you don't have to do this." "I know," he replied, "but I want to." We didn't say much, but when he turned to leave, I stood there for a long while, on the doorstep, holding a basket of fruit, watching the quiet figure walk away, and feeling an unfamiliar warmth. I'm not used to being cared for, even less so being noticed. But in that moment, a small crack opened inside me, and from that crack, something began to grow. That night, I placed my hand over my chest and felt my heart beating, not from illness, but because, for the first time in many years, I felt alive.
And seen. Truly.
Since that day, Ben didn't knock on my door every day.
But I always knew when he passed by.
Whether it was a simple wave when I happened to stand by the window, or a small nod as he took the trash out, each of those moments quietly planted something I thought I had lost: the belief that I was still seen. There were mornings when I sat silently at the table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea I hadn't yet touched, eyes drifting toward the front yard, when the sunlight sliced through the trees and fell across the windowsill. I'd often see Ben bent over, tending to the flowers by the fence. He didn't know I was watching, or maybe he did, but he never changed his pace. No words, no efforts to draw attention, just a man, living next door, present. I began looking forward to those mornings, not because I expected anything special to happen, but because sometimes to see someone and know they also know you're there is enough to give you a reason to keep going. Ben didn't ask much. Instead, he left small things behind. A bag of oranges hanging from the doorknob, a note that read, "Today's fruit is extra sweet. Make sure to eat." His handwriting was plain, but warm, like early spring sunlight. Some days it was a few sprigs of basil. Other times, a bag of homemade butter cookies. Simple gifts, never random. As if he knew, I didn't need anything grand. I just needed a reason to feel like today was different from yesterday. What gnawed at me, though, was how unfamiliar I was with being cared for. All these years, I had trained myself to be strong, to cook alone, go to the pharmacy alone, drive myself to appointments and come home in silence. I used to believe I didn't need anyone, but the truth is, I was just too afraid to need again, because I had needed before, and was let down. I had fallen,
And no one caught me.
Ben didn't do anything extravagant, but he showed up, quietly,
Steadily.
without asking for anything in return. And it was in those small things: a spoonful of soup, an apple, a few words left on a piece of paper, that the locked door inside me slowly began to open. One afternoon, I gathered the courage to wait for Ben outside. As he passed by, I said, "Thank you for everything." He looked at me, his gaze gentle and unhurried. "Martha, I didn't do anything big. Sometimes someone just needs to know they're still here." I laughed, not loudly, but enough to surprise myself. Maybe because it had been so long since I'd laughed without forcing it. That night, I sat by the window, the streetlight casting a warm golden hue over my teacup. For the first time, I brewed 2 cups of tea, even though I knew only one would be drunk. But maybe
Just setting out a second chair.
was already a quiet declaration. I was no longer afraid of emptiness. I was learning to welcome presence again. I wrote in my journal, "They say it takes grand gestures to change a life. But I think sometimes a patient glance, an orange on your doorstep, or a person who doesn't leave when you fall silent is enough to make you believe you still matter." I had been silent for so long that I had forgotten how warm my own voice used to be.
But then,
One quiet afternoon, in a small kitchen with just 2 people and a pot of boiling tea, I finally said aloud something I had kept inside for years. That evening, when I brewed tea for myself, I poured a second cup, even with no one there. Maybe tomorrow would still be lonely, But today, my heart knew. I was no longer just a fading shadow in the neighborhood. That day,